Welcome to the show, everybody. Today we're joined again by the very knowledgeable Steve Poikonen of Slow News Day and AM Wake Up, both on Rockfin. Steve, welcome back to the show.
What's happening, man? Thanks for having me back. It's good to be here.
So today we're doing movies that predicted the future, part two, and it's going to be maybe a little darker than the first show that we did. But I think one of your fans noticed that we skipped out on a big one, which is Children of Men. And that allowed me to ask you back on the show and spawn the discussion that we're about to have. So, Steve, why don't we start with V for Vendetta? I think that was a prescient film that really kind of predicted a lot of what went on in 2020, particularly, but the way that governments treat their citizens largely.
I love this flick. I do, and I have for quite a long time. And I very distinctly remember we were in Washington, D.C. It was the third week of February in 2020. So we're quite literally in that little period of time where the TV and the government are talking about lockdown, but haven't actually. I think it was the 29th when they actually issued, okay, we're locking down the country on March 15th. So we're in Washington, D.C., and all this is going like right, they pretty much about a month into them naming it, the coronavirus or COVID-19 or whatever. And as an Airbnb full of free speech and Julian Assange activists, we watched V for Vendetta together because we're like, well, if we're going to spend the next however long living in the real-time prequel of it, we might as well, familiarize ourselves or refamiliarize ourselves with the material. But there is just, even some subtleties in the flick that you don't necessarily catch the first time or two that have overlap in what we've experienced, even passively in the last few years. Yeah, it's a good choice. It is.
Yeah, and the character in it wears the Guy Fawkes mask. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about Guy Fawkes or the significance of the mask? I imagine you know a lot.
Well, so Guy Fawkes was a character in English history. I'm a guy who actually lived, but he lived as someone who became an anti-government figure, tried to blow up Parliament, and the English and really Western culture in general has always kind of had a streak where you lift up the anti-hero a little bit too. This may even perhaps be one of the origins of that in America. We've, the whole cowboy culture thing and outlaw thing, and everybody, if you, it used to be you were a celebrated American hero if your claim to fame was you got one over on the government and you won. You know what I mean? And we've gone so far afield from that. But Guy Fawkes was one of these characters. And so in that tradition, the people of England for centuries celebrate on the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day, where they would put on these masks or paper masks or whatever, the ones that we're familiar with from the film and then from the hacktivist collective Anonymous going forward. And they'd go hang out in the street and have a party. But yeah, the origin story is this guy wanted to blow up Parliament.
Yeah, I think they called him the last honest man to enter Parliament, was maybe something I heard.
Yeah.
And so the film's got politicians using a pandemic to consolidate power. It's got the protests met with violent force. Natalie Portman. There's a curfew.
You know what is also interesting, and this is something that we realized, in DC, because we were there with a bunch of Assange activists, but Evie's parents, the radicals who got killed in prison, the prison that they got killed in is the one that they threw Julian Assange in, that he's still sitting in right now. It's Belmarsh Prison. So even, in fiction land, it's still where you put your high profile dissidents.
You know, and you brought up the significance of Guy Fawkes Day in 2021, I believe. Movie theaters across the country partnered in November to show V for Vendetta all on the same day. So I think there were a lot of other people looking at the movie like, "Hey, I've seen this before," while they're watching the news.
There's a scene in that movie where a little kid gets killed by the cops because I think because she was tagging a wall or something like that. Uh, and that's one of the things that drives that's the catalyst that drives people out into the street. The reason you can tell that it's fiction is because not just in America or not just in the UK, but pretty much everywhere, the cops can murder a little kid in broad daylight, completely unjustifiably. And maybe once every 10 years, you get people mad enough to go out in the street over it. Off the bat, it's divisive, no matter what. Yeah, protests usually only affect a small amount of people first. Usually, nobody wants to see them whatsoever. Nobody wants to pay attention to the issue whatsoever until it gets out of hand. But now there's a whole anti or counter argument sphere of media to whatever the protest is. If we tried to right now organize a protest that said, I don't want elementary school kids to have a provable cancer causing chemical in their school lunches, you'd automatically have a media sphere built and designed to prove to debunk you because based on whether you went with the left or the right for an appeal for help.
Children of Men is another film that I think is in that same vein as V for Vendetta, and the film that really was the catalyst for this show. It's a dystopian drama released in 2006. It wasn't a hit at the time, directed by Alfonso Cuarón.
Well, yeah, it's one of those films where they're using pandemic as a means of method of control. It's one of the films where really, and I think I'm pretty sure the book came out in the 90s, but the it's an English film. It's a UK film. Like whatever the overtures to George Bush personally are, or that particular style of governance are, I think probably that's us reading it in in New Mexico and in the US. And if you were to ask the filmmaker, they might talk a little bit about Tony Blair more. And I mean, I remember they were interchangeable action figures. They were like all of their superhero jackets, whether it was like the flight suit or the baseball jacket, whatever their accessories were, they were all the same size. You could send Tony Blair out for George Bush and vice versa. You could. They were pretty interchangeable. But I do know that like the Brits in particular, they usually try to keep it as close to home as possible, and that's why you see the whole thing up on one of the main plot points in the film is that the main character in it, Clive Owen, is trying to help a poor immigrant girl, and there's a lot of overlap. Looking at it now, this is the cool thing about Children of Men. Looking at it now and looking at it at different points since it came out, you can find things that apply directly to the moment. That's what makes it a pretty unique film in terms of predictive programming or setting the table for future events, however you want to look at it. Because the way that the UK and Germany in particular, definitely not in 2006, but definitely in 2022, 2023, have adjusted their policy towards immigration is, I mean, it's on full display in the film. The conditions for why it happened get discussed in the film, and it's a reaction to Western imperialism that drives people out of their native homeland. And look, dude, If I was living in an African country right now, I would probably go look in the UK for my national sovereignty. I would probably look in France. You could look in the US because it's not in your home country, so it must be there because they're the people who took it, right? So let's go look. Let's go there and see if we can't find it. It's got to be lying around somewhere. I get it. I do.
Everybody, we're back. We're talking with Steve Poikonen of Slow News Day and AM Wake Up, both on Rockfin. Steve, we were talking about Children of Men and how that related to the pandemic of 2020.
Well, okay, so I think we were jumping off uh in terms of overlap in different eras, at least in the way that the film stands up. There's sort of an interesting arc in it where you've got the main character of the film who used to be a pretty I don't know, radicalized individual. He used to be, I guess you'd probably consider it like a progressive activist. And there's in the article that you sent, there's a line in it from the director about what they wanted him to be like, where it was something like he's a former radical that's lost so much he's become walking scar tissue. And this is something that you see a lot in like the Occupy crowd, the people who came out of that a decade or so ago, who went in highly radicalized, and a lot of them have come out either so jaded that they have a half acre off grid and no internet connection anymore, or they got absorbed like most of the people in Anonymous did, to kind of bring it around to V for Vendetta a little bit again, absorbed into the national security apparatus. And then you jump to this time last year where Hillary Clinton is on cable giving a wish list and to-do list to Anonymous on the air, even though when she was Secretary of State, she was making it her mission to have every single one of them rounded up and have the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act thrown at them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and you told us about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act on the last show. It was in the framework of the 1983 film War Games, starring Matthew Broderick. I think it was directed by Spielberg. And that was the law that they used, or that one of the laws that they used to falsely imprison Assange.
Yes, and really, really anyone that runs afoul of the federal government on the internet, and it still is never. There's never going to be a day that goes by that if I don't think about it, where I won't be amazed that War Games, the Matthew Broderick movie, is the reason our laws that govern our behavior on the internet exist. That's still mind blowing.
No, I think movies are really powerful. I think that was the reason for the Hollywood 10, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and so many of these propaganda films disguised as entertainment that we've seen over the past few decades. So I guess we left off a little bit about the immigration aspect of Children of Men, and I think that really rings true. You brought that up, the long lines at the borders.
Well, we also, and again, this is, the film's a UK film. It's written from that perspective. But in 2006, that wasn't the real tension in the country, and really the real tension in the West was a very strong anti-Muslim sentiment. Definitely not written that way in the film. However, just a few years later, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, France, to a degree, would all experience a massive influx of Syrian refugees from that region. They're all being treated like crap. This is an ongoing problem, and it's getting reawakened again in light of the massive earthquakes that just happened in Syria a couple of weeks ago. The U.S. is still operating with most of their sanctions, preventing aid from coming in. So what it's doing is what it always does, is creating massive influx of migrants to a number of different countries. And it's just this problem reaction solution thing that we see played out over and over again that always results on the rights of individual citizens getting trampled, and a reduction in overall human and basic civil rights.
Now, another couple of films that I think really played into today's topic were Contagion, starring Matt Damon, directed by Soderbergh, and also Outbreak. That was with Morgan Freeman and Dustin Hoffman. And maybe you want to start with Outbreak. Maybe there's less to say about that film than Contagion.
I mean, well, with Outbreak, you have a couple of different things. You have an example of a governmental response to a health emergency that is counterintuitive in the way that the health professionals had always done it. You've got a animal to human transmission as the reason for it. You come to find out that these institutions have already had a couple of plans in place in case a scenario like this arises. So there are definite overlaps in what we've experienced. But yeah, no, I think you're right about Contagion being a little bit more.
Yeah, Outbreak. It's a monkey that that releases a sort of Ebola virus or bubonic plague type of disease. And in Contagion, it's a pig that eats a bat and then is slaughtered, and then that's what spreads the disease to the public.
Yeah, and this is what I mean. This is one of those things that, at least in a Hollywood way, attempts to expose the bureaucracy that sort of is the underlying, I don't know, wheels or whatever, the gears that make all of this work, and that there's a definite difference between um the people who are, caught up in the moment in the middle of a medical emergency, who are trying to do what medical professionals try to do it or trained to do, and what people who have an actual real plan in place are trying to accomplish. The whole thing is fairly crazy. Plus, you've got the arc of the film where there's an existing independent media, or at least a semblance of it, and it's, those crazy internet bloggers that are going on and on about this virus. We got to do something about them too, and that kind of hits home.
Yeah. And, it's got the empty store shelves. It's got them saying, hey, you can't come in here. And he says, no, I'm immune. There were a lot of things that they had really thought about what it would look like and then put it on the screen to scare us in those days. Now it seems more like a manual.
Yeah, it does. And the way that they do Jude Law's character in that movie, though, really kind of feels like that was that was sort of one of the options that they could go with dealing with people on the internet that were putting out information that's counter to the narrative.
Also, part of this is, the New York Times just came out saying that the bat theory was unlikely or something to that effect. And a year ago, we couldn't even talk about this on my YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's correct. And what's interesting is that you can now talk about this as a legitimate theory, that out of all of the things besides a bat and a pangolin had a special hug or whatever, and then it wound up in soup at a wet market, instead of that, in its own right, highly plausible theory, the only other highly plausible theory that you're allowed to discuss is whether multiple world governments under international health protocols in a level 4 virology lab had an oopsie. Because if they Had an oopsie. Well, then that's just human error. And yeah, we can probably blame China because we're trying to go to war with them anyway. But what it's definitely not is a man-made weapon that was intentionally released, because that's just crazy talk. But the other two theories we have, totally plausible.
Yeah, and I think Kurt Metzger, who's often on your show, was the first person I heard to say it, that they said the lab leak theory was racist, as opposed to what they considered the not racist theory, that the wet market was so dirty and diseased that that's where it came from.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because that's cultural. and then you get a pass. I I love Kurt Metzger. Man, can I just quickly say how weird it's been that just a year ago I was merely someone who enjoyed this guy's comedy for 20 years, and like now we talk a lot. Like it's wild.
Everybody, we're back. We're talking with Steve Poikonen of Slow News Day and AM Wake Up. You could watch both of those on Rockfin. And today we're doing movies that predicted the future part 2. This is the pandemic edition. Or can I say pandemic? This is the 2020 flashback edition. And one we should probably mention, since it's heavy on a pandemic wiping out humanity, is the Terry Gilliam film 12 Monkeys. And it was 1994, Brad Pitt, Bruce Willis, and he's traveling back in time to stop a pandemic that happened in the 90s, and coming from 2085, I think, is when they send him back.
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah. It's so, man, this is a great movie. It's a good one. If you haven't seen it, or if you missed that whole arc of Hollywood filmdom because you weren't growing up through it, it is a little bit of a head tripper. There's, at least in terms of the capabilities of the state and what the state is or would be willing to do in order to alter events, that certainly would allow for it to gain an unbelievable amount of control, is one of the things that's on full display in this movie, just because of the major plot point that it's the state that's taking a prisoner in Bruce Willis, and sending him back. I think that's how it is. I'm pretty sure it starts out with Bruce Willis himself being
Yeah, they send Bruce Willis back in time, and then Brad Pitt is like, he's nuts, but he knows the truth, is how I remember it.
yeah. And well, it's one of those things where Brad Pitt's character has been institutionalized because of what he knew, and then through the institutionalization process is what's transformed him into the character that you meet when you meet him in the movie. But by all accounts, that character was, a traumatized and highly concerned individual when he was grabbed and thrown in to that particular institution. But it seems to be more that the group that he's trying to stop had him put there, as opposed to him being either voluntarily or state ordered to go into it. So even that, we've seen elements where major corporations or highly motivated individuals with a lot of corporate backing can have people removed from society and taken off the table. Yeah, no, it's a heavy flick. I dig it.
Yeah, and it's the army of the 12 monkeys that releases the virus, but they're an offshoot of the government, or it turns out that they're in on it the whole time. And maybe that's similar to how the U.S. creates our own wars, our own enemies to fight in these wars.
Well, and it's also there's the constant like deja vu sense that the characters in the film have. And we've kind of been hinting at it, if not, outright talking about it. But I mean, all of these movies that were made, one of the things that Bruce Willis's character in the flick, I mean, he's telling Brad Pitt, or he's telling somebody, um, I can't save you, nobody can. All this stuff already happened. Like, I don't. And there's been a lot of times very, very recently, especially with the lab leak thing and the Twitter files and all of these things that are just now coming out and breaking, that a number of us have been discussing and reporting on and talking about the whistleblowers of the original studies and preprints, where all of this really feels like, but hey, we've done this. I don't Why are you trying to tell them this right now? It's too late now. It was neat when we were talking about it and it seemed, immediate. And so the overlaps, I think, in this one are more psychological and more subtle than they are in a lot of other ones, but it is a very, very, very good movie for that reason, if none else.
I'm glad you brought up the Twitter files too, because I think a lot of the people listening to this station are listening to Tom Hartman or something like that, and they don't really necessarily know the significance of the Twitter files. That it wasn't just some news in passing, but it affects all of us. That it's not a partisan issue. It affects you whether you're on the right or the left.
Well, it does, and here's the thing that's and I understand why there are a number of people that are dismissive of it entirely because of the way that it's presented. And this is the thing that I go off on my shows, because I don't like the way that it's presented. I think the way that it's presented is a redefinition of journalism, where you're telling people just trust the screenshots. No, and they may be accurate, but we'll never know. You don't need primary source material. And if it's not coming from an outlet that's already been tailor-made to conform to your biases, you're already going to dismiss most of it out of hand anyway. So yes, there is, a huge corroboration of other people's work over a handful of years that disclosed via the Twitter files. And yes, it would be important for people who are, being introduced to this 3 years into it to examine it and take a look at it, familiarize themselves with the players. But then after that,
No, that's a good point too. And I was forgetting that much of what is being broken as news in the Twitter files is stuff that you were reporting on years earlier.
And this is one, I mean, and that's the deja vu part, but also it's one of those things where you're redefining journalistic standards and reality based on the individual that's delivering the message. Do you know what I mean? It's a conspiracy when I say it. It's tinfoil hat, cuckoo bird madness when Ryan Christian says it, or when either of us talk to Dr. Peter McCullough in 2021 in the summer, or when either of us.
Steve, tell us who Dr. Peter McCullough is.
He is the most published cardiologist in the history of cardiology, and he is now one of the scary doctors that was telling people that the COVID may not be as deadly as necessary, and was warning people about the very real adverse events that people are suffering today before they started suffering them, based on what he had been looking at.
Before we go to the break, let's start on Idiocracy, if that's okay with you. Since I'd hate for it to just be in the final segment. It's billed nowadays as a movie that started out as fiction but became a documentary. And there was so much there that was already part of our lives when the movie came out, but then we've seen it become exacerbated to a kind of cartoonish level.
It's getting to the point to where reality is the parody, and the Idiocracy now is some sort of oracle. I mean, it's less documentary than it is a a retelling of future events.
Yeah, I mean, to go from Beavis and Butthead to Office Space, which is like a Buddhist philosophical Taoist type theme, and then to really predicting the future, it's quite a journey for Mike Judge. He's also from New Mexico, in Albuquerque. Grew up in Albuquerque, I believe.
I'm a fan of Mike Judge's work. I really, to this day, there's still a bunch of stuff in King of the Hill that stands up that's super funny. I mean, that guy is hilarious. I remember watching. There was a pre-runner to Beavis and Butthead, and it was about the guy who would become Hank Hill. But it played at Spike and Mike's Twisted Animation way back in the day. And that was my first introduction to the non-Beavis and Butthead world of Mike Judge. And then this is the Idiocracy sometimes. If you haven't seen it at this point, I mean, now is the time, especially as we're getting ready to head into another election season.
Everybody, we're back. We're talking with Steve Poikonen of Slow News Day and AM Wake Up, and this is Movies That Predicted the Future Part 2. Steve, we were talking about Idiocracy before the break, so why don't we pick it up there, since there's so much to say about all the ways that Idiocracy foresaw the future. You called it an oracle?
Well, I mean, because the joke has been documentary, but it is prescient, so you kind of have to run with Oracle. You do. The even the presidential character, who was the professional wrestler,
Camacho.
yes. Well, Donald Trump's in the World Wrestling Hall of Fame for being a pretend bad guy. We elected a reality TV star in the World Wrestling Hall of Fame for being a pretend bad guy, a heel, became president. This is, I think, red flag one, that we were living in the land of Idiocracy. But people really didn't. They were, told to be angry at Donald Trump for a lot of other reasons, not because he actually is a paid professional actor who knows how to manipulate people and work a room. And boy, howdy, did he manipulate people and know how to work a room. Managed to get a whole lot of people mad at him for the wrong reasons. He had a whole bunch of people worship the ground he walked on for the wrong reasons. Yeah, that's a wonderful professional villain right there.
Well, yeah, and some of the hosts on this station will tell you that he's a Russian agent, and there's no doubt about it. And I think that really takes away from all the terrible things that he did, and also, keeps the public from criticizing an American president for all the terrible things an American president does. It kind of got bogged down in this, oh, he's a Russian, he's working with Russians. And then I think it also became a pretext for this proxy war in Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. What they fail to remember is that Donald Trump issued the first round of like brutal, crippling sanctions against Russia, openly provoking them, moving the capital of NATO closer to the Russian border. These were all open acts of provocation. This part of that, Trump is on record berating the German prime minister over funding in NATO, over taking Russian gas and letting them know that sooner or later they were going to have a price to pay for all that cheap Russian gas they've been getting. Well, it wasn't under his watch, but it was definitely with his national security advisor, John Bolton, in mind, that the Nord Stream 2 became, what did Ted Cruz call it? A hunk of metal on the ground, to which everybody, or at the bottom of the sea, to which everybody in the Democratic administration was like, yeah, that's right. That's not okay. Well, Ted Cruz said it, but Victoria Nuland agreed. So that's still our team. And, if you can't pick up on the continuity of government, in terms of the way that the empire always expands, the money for the military budget always increases, the amount of military bases we have worldwide always goes up, and the amount of national debt that we always have always goes up. I don't know what to tell you at this point. It's a two-party illusion.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Nord Stream too, because that has just been bonkers. Where I think it was Biz Journals called Seymour Hersh a blogger, and and so I mean, I guess we never find out about anything until Seymour Hersh finally writes about it in this country.
That's a fair point. Patrick Henningsen from 21 Wire was on the show this morning. He brought that up in regard to Abu Ghraib. He brought that up in regard to Obama's imaginary red line, the rat line in Syria. This is the reporter that disclosed the My Lai massacre. We have 50 years of Seymour Hersh moving U.S. policy because of his journalistic disclosures. There are a number of us that can come on the air after Seymour Hersh writes something and analyze it and break it down, discuss it, deconstruct it. But very few to none of us have the contacts, the reputation, the ability to get the information that Seymour Hersh gets to break it. And so for the White House to act like this or to treat him this way, or Business Insider or whatever to have this, because it was Ned Price from the State Department that called him a blogger, it is just, I mean, it is a deliberate attempt to dumb down the American population.
Well, and to discredit someone who's doing really good work.
Well, and to that point, too, what did they attack him for? Oh, there's anonymous sources. You can't do that and still be. You cite anonymous sources as the justification for you taking an entire country to war. Okay, so don't tell me that. And then when they come out yesterday with their, oh, it was a handful of pro-Ukrainian entities that did it. Well, who are you? Whose word are you going on for that? Oh, well, they're anonymous sources. They're high-placed government officials.
And that was the New York Times as well.
Yeah, and the Washington Post. Both of them ran with pro-Ukrainian entities. And I mean, you know, we checked. We did a quick search. The pro-Ukrainian entity that has pro-Ukrained to the point of $100 billion so far, the most out of anyone else ever, is the United States government. I can't think of a more pro-Ukrainian entity.
Yeah, and I heard we just approved another 400 million in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, well, it's not like there's problems at home that need a little bit of cash. I mean, it'd be different if there was a massive train derailment and largest dioxin explosion and spillover in the history of ever always. But since that hasn't happened, we're okay.
I think that's a great way to bring it back to Idiocracy, is the train derailments, the plane crashes. My ex-wife is living a great life. She's a pilot now. So many the huge garbage mountains. I think so much of that Mike Judge was just spot on. And in the article, I don't know if I sent you this one, but it's from
Guardian one, yeah.
yeah, and thank you. He talks about you walk into Costco and they say "I love you," the kind of being hammered over the head by brands and marketing.
Yep. And I look, we really aren't that far away from giving plants Brawndo. We really aren't that far. There have been a couple of stories that we've covered on the show in the last even couple of months where either Pasta or myself will be like, well, it's what plants crave. Because there's just, I mean, there's no other way to relate it to than this is equivalent to pouring Gatorade over your plant and expecting it to live.
You know, we talked about self-driving cars on the last episode, and we didn't get to Elon Musk, but I think a lot of people listening to this station dislike Elon Musk, but maybe you would think it would that they dislike him for the wrong reasons. Can you tell me a bit about that before we go?
Elon Musk is a military contractor. Elon Musk is selling surveillance and satellite equipment to a number of world governments at the behest of and giving a cut of the check to DARPA. Elon Musk is subsidized to the tune of 80% in some companies by the Pentagon. What Elon Musk represents is an archetypical character that you can hate for all of the wrong reasons, because a lot of those reasons are on display. But I would encourage people to be less emotional in their reactions to what they see in the immediate press about Elon Musk. Understand that this is a guy who does want to put a chip in your brain. This is a guy who is the, son of a blood emerald merchant. This is a guy who has never made anything. He's a good salesman, and he understands how to manipulate people via algorithm. But if you got him in person, he couldn't move you to do anything because he's an impersonable schlub. But
Hey,
because he understands the tech, he can move you. But I would look at him for his military connections and how destructive that can be, along with the brain chip, the Neuralink, and all of the transhumanist stuff.
yeah, that's what I was going to ask. He wants to put a chip in my brain?
Yeah, well, okay. In addition to being the co-founder of Neuralink, which, yes, they do want to do the human brain chip interface, and so that you can live forever in the cloud, he's also the co-founder of Chat GPT and OpenAI.
Let me do a little sign out. Everybody, this was Steve Poikonen of Slow News Day and AM Wake Up. You can catch him nearly every day on the Rockfin. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.